Today's real project is another one of those that helps me solve a problem in my garage. My issue is I have a set of slip rolls that's extremely heavy, and I store them upstairs in my loft. And whenever I want to use it, I gotta drag out this folding arc station, which is actually the easy part, set it up, go upstairs, pull this thing out, which it weighs over 100 pounds, I'm sure, and put it on my lift, bring it down here and set it up, clamp it to this table before I can even use it. So my project today is to build a swing out, heavy duty equipment stand that's gonna mount to one of my vertical posts in my shop. This way I can leave it down here, but when it's not in use, I can swing it out of the way against the wall and it doesn't take much room. So my first step is I'm going to take and measure where I want to mount this to my vertical post. I know I want it to be about the same height as the folding arc station I'm currently using because I'm very comfortable with it in that position. So that's going to be about 35 inches. So I'm going to actually run it about 35 and a quarter. I also need to make sure I have enough clearance for the top base plate so when I swing it out of position that it can swing up next to the wall. So I have about 5 3/4 inches of clearance there. So I will be notching a corner piece out of the top and bottom swivel brackets, and the top plate will sit right on top of that. The bottom swivel bracket is about 4 inches off the ground. And once I mount that plate, all I have to do is measure my diagonal, and I'll be building a square tube support to go from the bottom swivel bracket to the end of the mount. And that will make sure it supports that piece where it's way out, because this is going to be 36 inches away from this vertical post. So it needs something on the end to support it, all that weight. But when I swing that over out of the position when not in use, it'll slide up right next to the wall. I'm going to be using this piece of drop-off as a template to mark where I need to cut this corner out so this top swivel plate can get welded to the vertical post. So the next step's kind of critical. I need to measure the pivot point of this top mounting base plate. This is the piece that's going to get welded to that post. To figure that point out, I'm going to measure diagonally from the corner of the tube, and I need to make sure that I put this pivot point far enough away so that when the base plate is in full storage versus full extension, that I have enough clearance for it to make that swing around the post. Okay? So I'm planning on making mine about 2 3/8 inches away from the corner. That gives me 1 3/8 clearance that I can work with for the top plate to mount. Now keep in mind, you got to put a weld on this plate too, and the weld's going to take up at least 1/4 inch to 3/8. So that means I'll be taking and drilling my pivot point on my top mount about 1 inch from the end of the piece. The bottom swivel point isn't as critical. It's going to end up lining up anyway because I'm going to drop a plumb bob through the top pivot point, which will determine my cut point for the bottom pivot point. But I'm going to trace out one of these corners as well so I can plasma cut that corner out too. And remember, read and follow all labels and the owner's manual. I also took my grinder and ground off the mill scale on the plates and the posts where it gets welded to. That mill scale will add some contamination to your weld if you don't do that. So now I'm tack welding these plates onto my vertical posts. I'm going to be using the Miller 255 that I borrowed in the pulse MIG mode. I basically just set it on the auto set feature for 3/8 thick material. I'm then going to take my digital level and make sure that it's perfectly level both directions before I weld it in place. Now before I weld the bottom pivot plate to the post, I'm gonna drop a plumb bob through the top hole and make sure that it lines up to the bottom plate. I'm gonna make my mark there, and that's where I'm gonna machine my bottom 5/8 hole. That way I make sure that the top pivot point and the bottom pivot point are perfectly in line. So after I got it welded in, I would need to double check and make sure that my clearance is still where it needs to be before I machine the hole in my swivel base up on top. So I'll machine that hole and it'll line up with this one. And I have to make sure that I'm at least an inch away from the weld. That's what I calculated it as anyway. And I'm actually almost 1 1/8 inches there. So that'll give me enough clearance on that side. And then when I extend my platform out to its full open position, I still also have to have that same inch clearance to the weld here. And I'm at about 1 1/16 inches. So I'm good. So my original calculations will hold out. I can go ahead now and machine my 5/8 hole in my top plate. After I milled my 5/8 pivot hole in my mounting base, I also milled 2 1/2-inch holes, which will be used for my locking bolts. These will be tapped into the bottom plate. Once I extend the table out to full extension, I will screw 2 of these into the holes, and that'll lock this into place so it doesn't move while I'm using whatever tool is mounted to it. So I mounted both plates, the top plate and my bottom swivel plate, to their mounts. I put my digital level on here and I will shim this up until it's perfectly level. Then I can measure for my diagonal support tube that'll go from the end of the plate to the bottom swivel plate. Now that I've got everything welded into place, I've extended it all the way out so that I can transfer punch these top holes to the bottom plate, which will be drilled and then tapped for my 1/2-inch locking bolts. So there you go. One slip roll mounted to a heavy-duty swing-out equipment stand. It swings out of the way for storage, easily opens up for where I need to use it, put my locking bolts in, and it's super sturdy. You could mount a vise on this, even a small drill press, whatever.